Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at Morphy's with a fantastic example of a Dutch East Indies DWM production Luger pistol, along with its perhaps even scarcer holster and magazine pouch. So, we previously took a look at one of the Dutch Army trials pistols. We talked about the history of the abortive Dutch trials of the Luger. Well, the Dutch East Indies Army was really a almost completely independent organization from the main Dutch army, and the Dutch colonial forces were also in a position to want to replace their revolvers with self-loading pistols. Starting in 1905, the East Indies Army got its hands on a couple of Lugers to test. They spent a couple of years testing them, decided they really were quite good guns, they would like to adopt them. In 1910, they finish their testing, decide to adopt the guns. It takes another year to get the budget process through. The gun is adopted as the Model 1911, the M11 pistol. And the Dutch East Indies Army doesn't have the same political issues, political handicaps that the mainland, the home Dutch army does. And they're able to actually purchase these pistols. Now, they also have some budgetary limitations, and so they're basically ordering 1,000 guns a year starting in 1910, 1911. By the time World War I breaks out, they have actually purchased and received 4,181 M11 Luger pistols from DWM. Now, of course, once the war breaks out, DWM has more pressing concerns than shipping pistols to the Dutch East Indies, and so the supply kind of dries up. But the colonial army isn't fully equipped. They wanted a bunch more, and so almost immediately after World War I, they buy another batch of guns from the Vickers company, Vickers Armstrong. Now, the Vickers guns were not actually manufactured by Vickers. I actually have a separate video on the Vickers Lugers. The Dutch bought the East Indies Army bought 6,000 Vickers Lugers, but that also wasn't going to be enough to complete the armament for the army. They needed yet more of them. So the reason that the Dutch had to buy Lugers from the Vickers company was because DWM was prohibited from manufacturing military arms under the Treaty of Versailles, as enforced by the Allied Control Commission, which was a bunch of officers who went around checking up on German industry to make sure they weren't doing naughty things. Well, the Allied Control Commission packed up and completed its mission in 1927 and went home. And by complete total coincidence, in 1927, DWM started making Lugers again. Weird. The Dutch weren't apparently all that concerned with what Versailles might have said. The East Indies Army orders another 3,828 Lugers from DWM directly now in sometime between late 27 and early 1928. The guns are delivered in August and September of 1928, and that is what we have here, one of the 1928 DWM deliveries. So let's take a closer look at it, and I'll show you what distinguishing features the Dutch East Indies Lugers specifically have. The Dutch East Indies Army, from the very outset, chose to go with a 9mm Luger. Of course, when this contract began, 1911, there were still plenty of people purchasing 7.65mm Lugers, but the colonial army goes with 9mm, 4-inch barrel. These guns have grip safeties on them. They do not have shoulder stock lugs. And the M11 pattern would remain almost completely unchanged between the first purchases in 1911 and the last ones in 1928. The one difference is actually in the sear bar here. So prior to 1915, the way the Luger worked was that if you wanted to open the action, you had to deactivate the safety to do so. As long as that safety is in place, and you can see what's happening here, the sear bar hits the safety and can't open. Well, in 1915, DWM updates the design a bit and changes it such that now you can open the toggle with the safety engaged. And so really the only difference between the 1928 Dutch pistols and the pre-World War I Dutch pistols is that the later ones have been updated with that improvement. Other than that, we still have a DWM toggle, nothing over the chamber. We'll touch on this in just a moment. The serial numbers continued in the same range that the Dutch had started. So In fact, all of the Dutch M11 pistols are in the same serial number range. When they bought the ones from Vickers, they had them start at the end of the original DWM contract, and this second DWM contract picked up where the Vickers guns left off. So you'll find Dutch M11 colonial pistols numbered from 1 through 14,020. All of the Dutch guns also have a Dutch safety marking, so rust there. The loaded chamber indicators are marked in German, geladen. I mean, it's kind of pointless to even mark that. It's so tiny that you really can't hardly read it. But that's how the Dutch guns were made. Normally, on Dutch M11s, you would expect to see a date on the barrel, and that is the date that the gun was actually issued out and put into service. And the reason for this was in the East Indies, well, this was a harsh environment for firearms, and barrels would only tend to last 6 or 7 years before they were corroded and shot out and needed to be replaced. And so dating the barrel was a convenient way for the Army to keep track of essentially preventative maintenance. Now, it's not unheard of, it's uncommon, but not unheard of to have guns that don't have that barrel date. And the best explanation I have seen is that the undated ones are guns that went to a unit but stayed in essentially material reserve and were not actually issued out to a specific trooper. When they were issued, that's when wear and tear would start on the gun, and so that's when the dates were applied to the barrel. That would fit with the overall fantastic condition of this example, suggesting that it went to this unit right here, but was never actually issued and didn't see field service, hence didn't get ruined like most of the Dutch East Indies guns. One of the other characteristics of Dutch guns, perhaps the most visible one really, are these unit marking plaques, these brass plaques. The Dutch colonial army unit marked all of its guns, and on Lugers originally, up until 1919, they were marked back here, just stamped into the metal of the frame. In 1919, they changed that plan, and they went to a brass plaque affixed to the front of the trigger guard. So some of the early guns would get that plaque, and when they were applied, they would polish off the markings back here. So from 1919 until 1938, unit marks were up here, and they were a short style of unit marking. 1938, they decided to change it a little bit. They want to make the unit marks a little more descriptive and make them longer, and they're too big for this little plaque, so they go to a slightly larger plaque down here on the trigger guard, which lasts all of like a year before they change their minds again and switch to a large plaque here on the left side of the gun. And this would be the final pattern. And these plaques will identify the unit and the gun number. Now, this is the gun number of all of the guns in the unit, not specifically just the Lugers. So you might run into one that has gun number 150. That doesn't mean that that unit had 150 Lugers. It might mean that they had 140 rifles that were the first ones that were numbered, and then guns 140 through 150 are the Lugers. Anyway, in this case, I'm not sure about the VL. The K indicates that this particular gun went to the Garrison Company in Riau, and I'm probably mispronouncing that name. That's R-I-A-U. A couple other little minute notes for the Luger fans out there. These have a Crown N proof mark on them, which is the proof mark that was used for commercial sales pistols. However, it was also the nitro proof mark that was chosen for the Dutch Army. These guns didn't come out of commercial production. They were a specific standalone contract for the Dutch. They just happened to use the same proof mark stamp. And for this specific batch of 3,800 and change in 1928, the guns are all marked with this KLO or KOL, the O being the circle on the outside. The exact meaning of this mark is not clearly known. It's not documented anywhere. There are a number of theories. The best theory appears to be that it is KOL for colonies or Department of the Colonies, specifying that these are colonial army guns and not standard army guns. There are some holes in that theory, like why was it really necessary to do that? And this marking was not on either of the previous orders of Dutch East Indies Lugers. But like I said, it's not well documented, but it does appear on all of these guns. Now, while we're looking at this, I definitely want to show you the holster and the mag pouch, because these examples are such excellent condition examples. The East Indies Lugers have slightly different web gear with them than a lot of other places. So you'll see a bunch of, you'll see brass fittings on them. The holster itself, these were all made in the East Indies by a specific workshop set up to make colonial army web gear leather products. The holster itself does not have a magazine pouch. It's a nice solid flap holster. It has a pocket here on the side for the cleaning rod tool. It's a brass cleaning rod that also has a little oiler bottle in it. This one appears to be full of grease that's probably like 80 years old and from Sumatra. We're going to put that back in and not touch it. Even scarcer than the holster is the magazine pouch. This is somewhat unique to Lugers. The Dutch colonial army had 3 magazines issued per gun. So they had a 2 magazine pouch that they issued with each of the guns. These are extremely rare to find today. Also worth pointing out, one of the specific requests that the colonial army had was they wanted to make the magazines easy to disassemble because, well, it's the Dutch East Indies, it's a harsh environment for firearms and such, and they wanted to be able to clean out the magazines easily. And so they actually have specifically requested from DWM a quick removable floor plate. So this is just a little flat spring. We would normally use our cleaning tool to depress this, and can't really get in there with a finger. There you go. You would pull that back, and then you could just pull the floor plate off and clean the magazine. Well, they found fairly early in actual use that occasionally under recoil, this spring would lose its tension, and then the floor plate would fall out when you fired the gun, and then all your ammo falls out in your magazine spring, and that's like really bad. So they went ahead, they kept the quick detach magazine floor plates, but they also pinned them in the front. So it's a little more of a process now. You have to punch out the pin, then you can use the floor plate removal thing. But the Dutch colonial army Lugers are, I believe, the only ones that have that style of magazine. On the pouch, in addition to your 2 magazines, you also have the magazine loading tool, which is also a combination tool for the gun. So you've got a screwdriver on there as well. And you actually got a pin punch, useful for example, punching out the floor plate pin on the magazines. So this is the original issue, well, this is an original issue magazine pouch, which is super cool. Both the pouch and the holster have the markings we would expect. CW are the initials of the workshop that made these. N indicates that this is a new production item. If it was a repaired item, it would have a different letter there. I don't remember the exact letter for repaired, but and then the date of production. So this one is April of 1938. And then there is an acceptance stamp, which is really pretty faint here. It is AL. If we look at the holster, this is a lot clearer. You'll see the same markings. This holster was made by the same shop. The holster is a July of 1936, and AL is the acceptance committee. Those letters change. They started with, I believe, AA, and every time they put together a new committee, over a period of many years, the new committee would just iterate that letter 1. So AL is a little ways along, but AL was their accepting stuff in 36 and 38 both. There were actually a couple different patterns of holster. This is one that was introduced in 1933 that has a relatively small belt loop on it here, held on by a bunch of brass rivets. The earlier patterns actually were sort of a drop holster where there's a long strap and the belt attachment is up here. And in 33 they shortened that up to bring the holster right up onto the belt. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. The gun is, Dutch East Indies Lugers are rare. Finding them in this kind of condition is extremely unusual. That is really a magnificent specimen of the type. And the holster is rare. The magazine pouch is virtually unheard of. So it's the magazine pouch in particular is really quite unique to the Dutch East Indies Army. So hopefully you guys enjoyed getting a chance to take a look at these examples. It's fun being able to bring this sort of thing to you. Thanks for watching.